In Elmsfield, a quaint town known for its scenic beauty and tight-knit community, the evening had begun like any other, with families settling in for dinner and the local diner preparing to close up for the night. But as darkness fell, an ominous change swept over the town. Clouds gathered swiftly in the sky, darker than the usual storm clouds, swirling with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. At the local weather station, old Mr. Hawkins, who had been monitoring weather patterns for decades, noticed unusual electromagnetic readings on his equipment. "Never in all my years," he muttered to himself as he adjusted the dials, trying to make sense of the data. Lightning flashed across the sky, not in scattered bursts as was typical, but in concentrated, violent strikes that hit the same location repeatedly, the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place seldom visited and surrounded by old myths and ghost stories. The wind picked up, howling through the streets, carrying whispers that chilled the bones of those who heard them. Windows rattled in their frames, and the power flickered, casting homes into momentary darkness that seemed to linger. Pets, especially dogs, whined and paced, sensing the disturbance that their human companions could not understand. At the cemetery, the scene was otherworldly. The ground shook with each lightning strike, as if the earth itself was protesting. Tombstones vibrated, some toppling over, and the old iron gates swung wildly on their hinges. The rain began to pour, heavy and thick, washing over the gravestones, seeping into the soil. Deep beneath the ground, where the dead of Elmsfield had been laid to rest, something unnatural began to occur. As the rain soaked through the earth, it reached the coffins, and the bodies interred within. In a macabre symphony of nature and the inexplicable, the corpses absorbed the electrified water, remnants of life's essence imbued by the storm. The first signs of their reawakening were subtle. A finger twitched in a coffin buried 6 feet under, an eyelid fluttered in another. As the storm raged on, the movements grew stronger. The dead, fueled by some unknown force unleashed by the storm, found new vigor. Hands pressed against coffin lids, soil shifted, and slowly, the dead began their ascent to the surface. Back in town, the residents of Elmsfield remained blissfully unaware of the horrors unfolding at the cemetery. They secured their windows against the storm and commented on the strange intensity of the weather, never imagining that this night would be unlike any other. In the heart of the tempest, the boundary between life and death blurred, and the dead stirred from their eternal slumber, setting the stage for the nightmare that was about to unfold in Elmsfield. As the clock struck midnight, the violent storm that had besieged Elmsfield began to ebb, leaving behind an unnerving silence. The relentless rain subsided into a drizzle, and the clouds parted slightly, allowing the moon to cast a ghostly light over the town. A thick, oppressive fog rolled in from the direction of the cemetery, enveloping the streets in a dense, cold mist that seemed to swallow sound and light. In their homes, residents settled back into their beds, grateful for the apparent passing of the storm. But this calm was deceptive, for with the fog came a sinister presence. It started as a faint sound, barely perceptible, a soft shuffling, like the rustle of dry leaves blown across the pavement. But as the night deepened, these sounds grew in number and intensity, joined by a low, mournful moaning that drifted with the fog. Sarah, the young nurse from Chapter 1, was just arriving home after a late shift at the local clinic. She was accustomed to the quiet streets of Elmsfield at night, but this evening, something felt different. The air was heavier, charged with a tension that made her skin crawl. As she locked her car and headed to her front door, a chill ran down her spine, prompting her to quicken her pace. Once inside, Sarah peered out through her living room window, trying to penetrate the thick fog with her eyes. The street lamps were dim silhouettes, casting long, distorted shadows that danced in the mist. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog, a shape so grotesque and misshapen that Sarah gasped in horror. It was a human figure, but horribly decayed, its limbs twisted unnaturally and its flesh hanging in tatters. Frozen with fear, Sarah watched as more figures appeared, staggering through the fog with a haunting, relentless pace. They were the dead of Elmsfield, risen from their graves, now wandering the streets, driven by a mysterious and terrifying impulse. Their groans were a macabre chorus that filled the night, a sound of despair from voices that should no longer speak. Across town, other residents began to notice the disturbance. Lights flickered on in houses, faces appeared at windows, and soon, a panic began to spread. The town's emergency siren, in use for years, wailed into the night, a clarion call for all to take heed and lock themselves away. Sarah, realizing the danger, rushed to secure her doors and windows. She called out to her father, John, who had been asleep upstairs. Together, they moved through the house, reinforcing entry points and discussing in hushed, urgent tones what could be happening. John, a former police officer, was pragmatic yet visibly shaken. "We need to stay calm, gather supplies, and wait for daylight," he instructed, trying to mask his own fear. As they worked, the sounds outside grew closer and more desperate. Thuds echoed against their front door, and the moans intensified, as if the creatures outside were aware of the living humans within. Sarah and her father retreated from the windows, avoiding the sight of the decayed faces pressed against the glass, their eyes hollow, their expressions a ghastly grimace of their former selves. With the town under siege and the dead wandering freely, Elmsfield had become a landscape of nightmares. The once peaceful community was now a place of terror, each household an island of fear in a sea of fog and darkness, waiting helplessly for the dawn to reveal the full extent of the horror that had awakened. Sarah and John huddled in the dimly lit living room, each clutching a makeshift weapon, a baseball bat for John and a heavy flashlight for Sarah. The silence inside was stark against the chaos outside, broken only by their shallow breaths and the occasional distant scream that pierced the night. Despite John's assurance that they should stay put until daylight, Sarah's nerves were frayed. As a nurse, she felt a compelling duty to help, yet the terror outside her door made her question whether she could even make it back to the clinic if needed. The clinic, with its more secure infrastructure and medical supplies, suddenly seemed like a safer haven than her own home. Gathering her courage, Sarah proposed a risky plan. "Dad, I think we should try to get to the clinic. It's built to withstand emergencies, and there might be others who need medical help." John was reluctant, knowing the dangers that awaited them outside. But recognizing the resolve in his daughter's eyes and the potential need for her skills, he agreed. Equipped with just their crude weapons and a flashlight, they opened the back door and stepped into the misty night. The fog was thick, reducing their world to a small circle of dim light from Sarah's flashlight. They moved stealthily, avoiding the main roads, their ears straining over the heartbeat thumping in their ears for any signs of the undead. As they neared the clinic, the true horror of their situation became apparent. The streets were littered with abandoned cars, their doors ajar and windows smashed. Grotesque figures roamed aimlessly, their moans more sorrowful up close. Sarah gripped her flashlight tighter, her other hand on the small of John's back as they navigated the chaos. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the fog directly in their path. Sarah froze, the beam of her flashlight settling on a young woman standing eerily still in the middle of the road. The woman's eyes were vacant, her jaw slack, but she was unmistakably one of the undead. Sarah's heart pounded. She knew this woman, Mrs. Gilbert, a teacher from her high school, now a grotesque version of her former self. Reacting instinctively, John stepped in front of Sarah, raising his bat. But as he swung, another figure lunged from the side, unseen until it was nearly upon them. Sarah screamed, swinging her flashlight in a wide arc. The heavy end connected with a sickening thud, and the figure crumpled to the ground. Shaken but unharmed, they hurried away, realizing that the danger was even greater than they had feared. The encounter left them both with a visceral understanding of their plight. These creatures, these twisted echoes of their former neighbors, were relentless and seemingly everywhere. When they finally reached the clinic, the relief was palpable. The reinforced doors and barred windows offered a semblance of safety. Inside, they found a few other survivors, including Linda, a fellow nurse, and Dr. Ellis, the town's general practitioner. The clinic had become a makeshift fortress, lit by emergency lights, with tables barricaded against windows and medical supplies neatly organized for easy access. As they shared their harrowing journey, Sarah and John could see the clinic was already treating several injured survivors, the beds filling with both the wounded and the utterly terrified. It was clear that Sarah's skills were needed here, but the safety of the clinic was a temporary comfort. Outside, the night raged on, and with each passing hour, more of the undead gathered, drawn by the living souls inside. Their night of terror was far from over, but for now, Sarah, John, and the others found strength in their unity, preparing to face whatever the dark fog might bring next. Inside the clinic, the atmosphere was tense but organized. Dr. Ellis took command, directing the medical staff with quiet efficiency while John and a few other able-bodied survivors worked on reinforcing the building's security. They dragged filing cabinets, chairs, and anything heavy in front of windows and doors, creating makeshift barricades against the nightmarish creatures outside. Sarah, her nursing instincts fully engaged, moved between the small wards and makeshift treatment areas set up in the clinic's various rooms. The injured varied from those with minor wounds to more severe cases that were beyond her ability to treat with the limited resources they had. Among them was a young man with a deep gash in his arm, likely inflicted by one of the undead. His eyes were wide with shock as Sarah cleaned the wound, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. Outside, the fog continued to hang heavy, obscuring vision but not the sounds of the undead. The groans and scratches at the barricaded doors served as a constant reminder of the peril just beyond the walls. Every now and then, a face would press against the small, reinforced glass part of a door, its eyes empty, mouth agape, a silent scream of hunger etched into its features. Linda, working alongside Sarah, whispered, "It's like they know we're here, like they can sense the life inside." Her voice was a mix of fear and wonder, reflecting the surreal nature of their situation. Sarah nodded, feeling a chill run down her spine. The behavior of these creatures was unsettlingly purposeful. Dr. Ellis approached the nurses, his face grave. "We need to discuss plans for the long term," he said quietly. "This may not be over soon, and our supplies are limited. We need to consider making a run for more medical supplies and food." John, overhearing the conversation, joined in. "I can go," he offered. "I know a route to the pharmacy a few blocks away. It's risky, but with a couple more volunteers, we might make it without drawing too much attention." The group weighed the risk. The idea of venturing out into the fog was daunting, but the necessity of securing additional supplies was undeniable. Finally, it was decided that a small team consisting of John, 2 other survivors, and Dr. Ellis would make the attempt at dawn when visibility might be better and the undead potentially less active. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to tend to the patients, her mind racing with all the possible scenarios that could unfold. Each moan from outside tightened the knot of fear in her stomach, but the trust and reliance of the wounded on her skills fortified her resolve. As night deepened, the clinic settled into a watchful quietude, broken only by the occasional cry of pain or whispered plans for survival. In the back room, Sarah found a moment to herself, gazing out of a small, barred window at the fog-shrouded town. The sight of Elmsfield, once so familiar and comforting, now transformed into a landscape of horror, made her heart ache for the world she knew, a world that seemed lost forever in the shroud of this endless night. As dawn approached, the dense fog began to thin, revealing the desolate streets of Elmsfield. The light of the early morning sun cast long, eerie shadows and illuminated the faces of the undead that lingered outside the clinic, their numbers seemingly multiplied through the night. Inside, the survivors prepared for the crucial mission to retrieve supplies. John, Dr. Ellis, and 2 volunteers, Mike and Elaine, geared up. They wrapped themselves in thick layers of clothing to protect against bites and grabbed anything that could be used as a weapon, pipes, bats, and even a crowbar. Before leaving, John turned to Sarah. "Keep everything locked down until we're back," he said, his voice tense but determined. Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of dread and hope. The group slipped out through a back exit that led into an alley, avoiding the main street where most of the undead seemed to congregate. The silence of the morning was deceptive, the terror of the night was not visible but palpable in the air they breathed. As they made their way to the pharmacy, the group kept close to the buildings, using the shadows as cover. The town looked apocalyptic, cars abandoned mid-escape, windows smashed, and doors ajar. Every so often, they would stop, holding their breath as a figure shambled past, unaware of their presence. At the pharmacy, the door was surprisingly intact. Dr. Ellis used the crowbar to pry it open, and they quickly slipped inside, locking the door behind them. The inside was a mess, shelves overturned, medicines scattered on the floor, a clear sign of the initial panic that had hit Elmsfield. They split up, each person searching for essential supplies, antibiotics, bandages, painkillers, and anything else that could be useful. Meanwhile, back at the clinic, Sarah and the others maintained a tense vigil. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Sarah found herself jumping at every noise, her nerves frayed by the constant stress. Linda stayed by her side, trying to offer comfort with her presence. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the front of the building. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she and Linda rushed to see what had happened. One of the barricades had given way under the relentless pressure from outside. Zombies were pushing through the opening, their grotesque faces snarling as they entered the clinic. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and started swinging it with all her might, knocking back the first few who entered. Linda shouted for help, and soon other survivors joined, pushing back against the invaders with anything they could wield. After a fierce struggle, they managed to secure the breach temporarily. Panting and shaken, Sarah looked around at the scared faces of her fellow survivors. The encounter left everyone on edge, knowing now more than ever that their safety was precarious. Outside the pharmacy, John and his team filled backpacks with supplies, moving quickly to avoid drawing attention. But as they prepared to leave, a distant sound of breaking glass and the subsequent moans alerted them that their presence had not gone unnoticed. The mission back to the clinic would be a dangerous race against an encroaching horde stirred into activity by the light of day. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the streets of Elmsfield filled with an eerie, restless activity. The noise from the pharmacy attracted more of the undead, and their numbers seemed to swell with every passing moment. Inside, John, Dr. Ellis, Mike, and Elaine hurried to finalize their supplies, aware that time was running out. Back at the clinic, Sarah and the others regrouped after repelling the initial breach. The mood was somber, the close call had shaken everyone, and the realization that their sanctuary could be compromised at any moment weighed heavily on their minds. Sarah, despite her exhaustion, took charge of reinforcing the weakened points of their defenses. She rallied the survivors, directing them to use heavier furniture and medical equipment to block the windows and doors. Meanwhile, at the pharmacy, John's team prepared to make their escape. They had collected as many medical supplies as they could carry and were now faced with the daunting task of returning to the clinic amidst the growing horde of undead. Dr. Ellis took a deep breath and addressed the group. "We need to stay close, move quickly, and avoid any unnecessary confrontation. Our lives depend on it." They opened the back door of the pharmacy cautiously, peeking out to scan their surroundings. The coast was momentarily clear, and they seized the chance to slip out, moving swiftly and silently back towards the clinic. Their route took them through narrow alleys and behind abandoned vehicles, offering some cover from the wandering zombies. As they progressed, the sounds of the town in distress filled the air, distant screams, the occasional crash, and the constant, chilling moan of the undead. The tension was palpable, each member of the group keenly aware of the risk they were taking. Despite their careful movements, a small group of zombies eventually noticed them. The situation escalated quickly as they were forced to run, the sound of their footsteps attracting even more attention. In a desperate bid for safety, Mike, who was at the rear, tripped and fell. The others turned back just in time to see him being swarmed. Dr. Ellis and Elaine made a split-second decision to go back for him, while John urged them to continue. "We can't help him now. We need to get these supplies back," he shouted, torn between his mission and leaving a man behind. Reluctantly, Dr. Ellis and Elaine followed John, leaving Mike to his fate, their hearts heavy with guilt and grief. They pushed forward, dodging and weaving through the undead, using their makeshift weapons only when absolutely necessary to conserve energy. Finally, they saw the clinic ahead, a beacon of hope amid the chaos. As they approached, they could see figures at the windows, Sarah and the others, watching anxiously for their return. The relief on Sarah's face when she saw her father was palpable, even from a distance. They reached the clinic, and the doors were quickly unlocked to let them in. Once inside, the doors were secured again, and the supplies were hurriedly taken to the storage room. Everyone gathered around, relief mixing with sorrow as they accounted for their losses and successes. Despite the grief for Mike and the constant threat outside, the successful return of the supply team brought a renewed sense of hope to the survivors. They knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but for now, they had the supplies needed to last a little longer, and the unity of their group was stronger than ever. The return of John, Dr. Ellis, and Elaine with supplies provided a temporary uplift in spirits at the clinic, but the loss of Mike cast a shadow over the small victory. As they distributed the medical supplies and fortified their food rations, Dr. Ellis called for a quiet meeting with John, Sarah, and a few other key members of the group to discuss the situation more thoroughly. Gathered in a small, makeshift office away from the others, Dr. Ellis shared a disturbing theory he had pieced together about the origins of the outbreak. Before this all started, I was treating several patients with unusually severe neurological symptoms, he began, his voice low and steady. I couldn't pinpoint the cause then, but thinking back, all these cases originated around the area where the old chemical plant used to operate. John leaned forward, interest piqued. "Are you suggesting the plant has something to do with this?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Yes," Dr. Ellis continued. "It's well known that the plant had a less than stellar record with waste disposal. I think the recent storm and the lightning strikes might have released some buried contaminants into the soil, contaminants that could have reached the cemetery." Sarah, listening intently, felt a chill. "So, you're saying the chemicals alter the bodies in some way?" she asked, struggling to grasp the horrifying concept. "Possibly reactivated them," Dr. Ellis nodded grimly. "It would explain the concentrated outbreak in this area, starting from the cemetery." The room fell silent as the implications sunk in. If Dr. Ellis was right, they were dealing with something beyond any of their worst fears, an environmental disaster turned apocalyptic nightmare. John broke the silence. "We need to get this information out. We need help from outside, from someone who can handle biohazard situations." Elaine, who had been quiet, spoke up, "But all communications are down. The cell towers, internet, everything's been cut off since the storm." "We have the old ham radio in the basement," Sarah suddenly remembered. "It's old, but it might just work. If we can get a message out, we can guide someone here." The group agreed that this was the next logical step. John and a couple of others set off to clear and set up the radio room while Sarah and Dr. Ellis organized a list of supplies and information they would need to broadcast for help. As the day turned to evening, Sarah and Linda descended into the basement to work on the ham radio. The equipment was dusty and outdated, but after several tense minutes, they managed to power it up. Adjusting the dials, Sarah's voice crackled over the airwaves, a beacon of hope as she repeated their coordinates and the nature of their emergency. Hours passed with no response, and the weight of their isolation grew heavier. But just as they were about to give up for the night, the radio crackled to life. A voice, distorted by static, confirmed receipt of their message, promising to relay it to the authorities. Relief washed over Sarah and Linda, their first real hope in days that rescue might be on the way. Back upstairs, the group fortified their position, knowing that even with potential help coming, the night would bring more challenges. They were trapped in a deadly siege, but now there was a glimmer of hope that they might not be left to face it alone. The response over the ham radio had given the survivors in the clinic a renewed sense of purpose and a glimmer of hope. As the group prepared for the night, there was a palpable shift in morale. Knowing that their message had been received meant that help might be on the way, but they also understood that surviving until rescue arrived was entirely up to them. With the revelation about the chemical plant and its possible effects, the group decided it was no longer safe to remain in Elms Field. The decision was made to evacuate to a nearby town, which, according to the last radio transmission, was setting up a safe zone for survivors. Dr. Ellis outlined the plan. They would travel in 2 large vans found in the clinic's garage, which were previously used for patient transport. These vehicles could hold everyone and were stocked with medical supplies, making them ideal for the journey. Early the next morning, under a gray, somber sky, the group began loading the vans with supplies. Sarah and John worked side by side, checking and rechecking the list of essentials: food, water, medical kits, and the ham radio. Meanwhile, Dr. Ellis and Linda coordinated the boarding process, ensuring that the elderly and injured were comfortably settled into the vans. As the convoy was ready to set out, a dense mist rolled in, reducing visibility to just a few feet. The drivers, equipped with maps and flashlights, navigated carefully, with John leading the first van and Elaine driving the second. The group maintained radio contact between the vans, constantly updating their status as they slowly made their way out of town. The journey was tense, the fog made it difficult to see more than a short distance ahead, and every shadow seemed to move. Sarah kept a watchful eye out the back window, her heart racing every time she saw a figure staggering in the mist. The road was littered with abandoned vehicles and debris, making the drive even more hazardous. Halfway through their journey, as they approached a narrow bridge, the lead van suddenly stopped. Ahead, the bridge was blocked by overturned cars and a bus, making it impassable. John radioed back to Elaine, "We've got a blockage. Looks like we'll need to clear it or find another route." The group quickly devised a plan. While half of the team stood guard, armed with whatever weapons they had, the others began the arduous task of clearing the debris. The physical effort was draining, and the constant fear of attack made every movement frantic and hurried. Just as they were making progress, a horde of undead emerged from the fog, attracted by the noise. The group was forced to defend their position. Sarah, gripping her makeshift weapon tightly, stood beside her father as they fought back the encroaching zombies. It was a desperate battle, and every member of the group had to participate to hold them off. After what felt like hours, they managed to clear enough space to squeeze the vans through. Wasting no time, they quickly loaded up and continued their escape, hearts pounding and nerves frayed from the encounter. As they drove away from the bridge, the sun began to break through the fog, casting light over the landscape. It was a welcome sight, symbolizing hope and a new beginning. The convoy pressed on, determined to reach the safety of the nearby town. Though the road ahead was uncertain and likely fraught with danger, the spirit of unity and survival among the group was stronger than ever. They had faced unimaginable horrors together, and now, as they left the haunted shadows of Elmsfield behind, they carried not only the scars of their ordeal but also the bonds forged in the fire of shared adversity. As the convoy drove onward, the landscape around them began to change. The dense, oppressive forests of Elmsfield gave way to more open fields, offering a sense of relief and space. However, the tranquility of the open land was deceptive, as the group soon discovered. Several miles from their destination, the road that would lead them directly to the safety zone was unexpectedly blocked by a massive fallen tree, an obstacle too large to move without heavy machinery. As John and Elaine brought the vans to a stop, a quick assessment made it clear they would need to take a detour through a small, seemingly abandoned town nearby. Navigating through the town's narrow streets, the tension in the vans was palpable. Every shadow in the windows of the deserted houses seemed to watch them pass, and every silence was filled with the potential for danger. The reality of their situation was grim, fuel was running low, and the detour had put a significant strain on their resources. Suddenly, from the back of the convoy, Elaine's voice crackled over the radio, fraught with urgency. "We've got a problem, a big one," she announced. The rear van had stalled, its engine dead. As the group convened to investigate, they realized it wasn't a simple mechanical failure. The van had been running on fumes, and now they were officially out of gas. Stranded in the unfamiliar town, with one functional van and half their group vulnerable, the decision was made to fortify their position and defend until they could figure out a solution. They parked the functioning van in a semicircle, using it as a barricade, and unloaded whatever they could use as weapons. John, taking on the role of the leader, instructed everyone to stay alert. "We need to keep watching shifts. Sarah, Linda, you help Dr. Ellis tend to everyone and keep them calm." "I'll take the first watch," he said, setting up at the front with a clear view of the main road. As night began to fall, a thick fog similar to that of Elmsfield descended upon the town, bringing with it an all too familiar sense of dread. The undead, attracted by the noise and perhaps the lingering scent of the living, began to converge on their location from all directions. The group fought valiantly, their backs against one another, as the horde pressed in. Sarah found herself side by side with her father, each saving the other more than once. Despite their exhaustion and fear, there was a fierce determination not to let this be the end. During the lull in the waves of attackers, a shout came from the direction of the stalled van. Elaine had been working frantically under the hood, aided by the light from several flashlights. "Got it," she cried out. "It's not a permanent fix, but it might just get us out of here." With renewed hope, the group quickly reorganized. They transferred essential supplies to the now running van, preparing to make a break for it. John gave the signal, and as the engine roared to life, the survivors piled in, ready to escape the encroaching darkness once more. The drive out of the town was tense, with every turn and shadow potentially hiding more danger. But as the first hints of dawn began to color the horizon, the survivors saw the outskirts of the safety zone, a fenced and well-guarded area, with lights cutting through the darkness and guards on watch. As they approached the gate, relief washed over them. They had made it. They had survived the night, the town, and the relentless pursuit of the undead. The guards quickly ushered them inside, where medical tents and food supplies were waiting. Inside the safety zone, as they received care and comfort, the survivors of Elmsfield shared their story. They spoke of their losses, their fears, and the unbreakable bonds they had formed. The ordeal was over, but its impact would last a lifetime. They were safe now, but they knew that the world outside the fences was forever changed. As the first rays of sunlight spilled over the safety zone, illuminating the faces of the weary survivors, there was a palpable sense of both relief and sorrow. The survivors, now safe behind the guarded fences, faced the dual reality of their rescue and the profound losses they had endured. Each one carried the weight of memories too painful to revisit and losses too deep to articulate. Sarah, alongside her father John, sat quietly on one of the benches scattered around the camp, watching as the camp staff moved efficiently, tending to the needs of newcomers. Around them, children played tentatively under the watchful eyes of their parents, and groups of survivors gathered, sharing their stories in hushed tones. The atmosphere was one of a community reborn from the ashes of catastrophe. Dr. Ellis, who had become the unofficial leader of their group during the ordeal, organized a small meeting with the camp officials. He relayed the details of their escape, the condition of Elmsfield, and his suspicions about the chemical contamination that might have triggered the catastrophic events. The officials listened intently, taking notes and promising that a team of experts would be dispatched to investigate the old chemical plant site as soon as it was deemed safe. Back at the survivors' area, Sarah and Linda, who had worked tirelessly as a nurse throughout the crisis, provided help to the medical teams in the camp. Their experience over the past few days had given them a unique perspective on trauma care, and their input was invaluable in organizing the camp's medical resources. John, feeling the weight of his experiences, took it upon himself to start a memorial wall within the camp. It was a simple yet poignant tribute to those lost, a place where survivors could write the names of loved ones, share memories, and offer messages of hope. As people began to gather around the wall, it became a place of shared grief and healing, reflecting the collective mourning and resilience of the human spirit. In the late afternoon, the camp held a communal gathering. A large bonfire was lit, around which everyone gathered. One by one, survivors stood to speak, sharing stories of survival, loss, and heroism. Sarah, with her father's encouragement, spoke about the unity and bravery of their group, her voice steady but filled with emotion. As night fell and the fire crackled, the camp leader addressed the group. He spoke of the challenges ahead, the need for rebuilding, and the importance of community in overcoming the darkness they had faced. He assured them that while the road ahead would be difficult, they would not walk it alone. The meeting ended with a moment of silence for the fallen, after which people slowly dispersed, some staying by the fire, finding comfort in the presence of others, while others sought the solitude of their tents. For Sarah and her group, the end of their harrowing journey marked the beginning of a new chapter. While the scars of their experiences would never fully fade, the support and bonds formed through their shared ordeal offered a foundation for healing and rebuilding. As they looked towards a future filled with uncertainty, they did so with a sense of hope, strengthened by the knowledge that they had survived the worst together and could face whatever came next with the same courage and unity.